In this section of the lecture, I want to discuss Rawls's conception of public reason and Foucault's account of neoliberalism briefly. I want to outline Rawls's conception of public reason and indicate several ways in which it is clearly a historical phenomenon, subject to variation over time. And I do this in order to be able to show how Foucault's lectures on neoliberal governmentality may be seen to contribute to the genealogy of late 20th century public reason. So building on the conclusion drawn at the end of the previous section, I want to argue that governmental reason in Foucault's sense of the term may become part of public reason proper, and that Foucault's proposed genealogy of modern governmental reason points to particular ways in which public reason has changed in the course of the 20th century. So this is a second point of connection, a second way I want to suggest in which Foucault's genealogy of modern governmentality has implications for normative political theory. So I begin with the historicity of public reason according to Rawls. Central to Rawls's conception of liberal democratic government is a conception of public reason, by which he means the reasoning of citizens about matters of basic justice and public good. And this reasoning is governed by an ideal of respectful and reciprocal relations between citizens who are supposed to be aware of a diversity of moral, religious, and philosophical doctrines among them. This ideal specifies the manner in which citizens should determine their collective will in drawing up and amending a constitution, in enacting laws relating to the basic structure of society, and in addressing fundamental questions of justice. It implies relatively stringent restrictions on the kinds of reasons that citizens can put forward in arguing a point of view on essential constitutional issues or matters of basic justice. In their public deliberation, citizens in a well-ordered society, Rawls says, must respect a duty of civility that requires them to be prepared to, as he put it, explain the basis of their actions to one another in terms each could reasonably expect that others might endorse as consistent with their freedom and equality. Citizens should offer reasons to one another that appeal only to beliefs, grounds, and political values it is reasonable for others to also acknowledge. That's Rawls again. Now, not all the discussions in which citizens engage will be subject to the restrictions of public reason, of course, and Rawls specifies that these limits don't apply to personal deliberations or discussions that take place outside of the formal political process, all of which are considered part of the culture that is the background for public political reason. Background culture includes all of the kinds of non-public reasoning found in churches, universities, scientific societies, professional groups, and other organizations. It includes as well the philosophical theories in terms of which philosophers might theorize about politics and the political domain. Within this sphere, citizens may argue about all kinds of things related to the political and the public good, including theories of justice and the nature and business of government, from the perspective of their respective comprehensive beliefs and commitments. Rawls's contrast then between public and non-public reason seems intuitively straightforward, but the precise nature of the border between them is far from certain. Uncertainty arises firstly because of the way that the restrictions imposed by the ideal of public reason have been weakened by Rawls's successively more inclusive versions of what he calls the proviso that allows non-public reasons to be invoked in public forums so long as properly political reasons that support whatever it was the non-public reasons were supposed to support can be provided in due course. So, for example, in his late essay, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited, Rawls suggests that 19th century anti-slavery campaigners in the US who defended immediate and uncompensated universal emancipation on religious grounds fulfilled the proviso because they were defending basic liberal constitutional values. they could have provided reasons in the terms of a reasonable conception of justice. Secondly, the constraints imposed by the ideal of public reason are weakened by Rawls's acknowledgement that the content of public reason is not specified by any one political conception of justice, but rather by a family of reasonable political conceptions. The political values that all can agree it is reasonable to acknowledge will form the basis of an overlapping consensus around a family of political conceptions of justice. In a given society at a given time, the content of political liberalism, and therefore the values that set limits on public political reasoning, will be determined by the available political conceptions of justice. And these in turn will depend on the settled convictions of the society, along with the background culture that sustains efforts to systematize and theorize such judgments. The idea that settled convictions may change is implicit in Rawls's suggestion that the conception of justice the parties to the original position would adopt, as he puts it, identifies the conception of justice that we regard here and now as fair and supported by the best reasons. The phrase here and now indicates that the conceptions of justice that would be adopted by rational and reasonable parties under the restrictions imposed by the veil of ignorance express the considered judgments of a historically specific form of society. As those judgments or convictions change, so too might the details of the conception of justice. In a given society at any given moment, what can properly be said within the sphere of public reason will be constrained by the norms of the existing family of reasonable conceptions of justice. The existing reasonable conceptions of justice will in turn depend on the settled convictions of the society, along with the background culture that sustains efforts to systematize and theorize such judgments. Rawls notes that the political conceptions of justice may be revised as a result of their interactions with one another and as a result of the emergence of new social groups and hitherto unrecognized political problems. He points out that the family of liberal political conceptions of justice may vary over time, as new variations may be proposed to existing conceptions in response to new or newly perceived problems, just as older conceptions may no longer be represented. He writes, "It is important that this be so, otherwise the claims of groups or interests arising from social change might be repressed and fail to gain their appropriate political voice." In the introduction to the paperback edition of Political Liberalism, he notes that the principles, ideals, and standards of argument that make up the content of public reason are those of, quote, a family of reasonable political conceptions of justice, and this family changes over time. In view of the complex and changing nature of the family of reasonable political conceptions, the ideal of political reason requires only that citizens should conduct their discussions on fundamental issues, as he puts it, within the framework of what each regards as a political conception of justice, based on values that others can reasonably be expected to endorse. In addition to political values, public reason includes a range of norms of reasoning and standards of argument and evidence that govern properly democratic deliberation. As Rawls's own theory of justice as fairness shows, the political values that define a given liberal concept of justice must be supplemented by a range of economic, sociological, and psychological ideas in order to be fully developed into a conception of the basic structure and institutions of a just society. Here too, as in the case of political values, the criterion of what properly belongs to public reason derives from the democratic ideal of rational and reasonable citizens. As far as possible, Rawls suggests the forms of knowledge and ways of reasoning appealed to in applying principles of justice to constitutional essentials and matters of basic justice should involve, quoting him, only plain truths now widely accepted or available to citizens generally. This implies that the content of this evidentiary and argumentative component of public reason may change along with changes to the content of, quote, plain truths widely accepted. So, for example, while the appeal to reasonableness may dictate that scientific views about climate change that are widely accepted by a majority of specialists in the relevant fields should form part of public reason, this might not apply when such views were first proposed or as long as they remain controversial. Turning then to neoliberal governmentality and public reason, Foucault explains at the end of his first lecture in 1979 that the focus of his course will be the liberal governmentality that emerged in Europe in the course of the 18th century. And indeed, his initial lectures in that course canvass some of the features that differentiate this liberal art of government from the raison d'etat and the form of police government that it superseded. However, after 3 lectures, Foucault turned to the analysis of German neoliberalism associated with the Freiburg School and to the American liberalism associated with the Chicago School. He sought to show that liberalism amounted to a reinvention of liberal government rather than simply a reprise of classical liberalism. Whereas the problem of classical liberalism in the 18th century was to show how to limit the activities of an existing state to make room for the market and the economic freedoms it required, the issue for neoliberals was in a sense the opposite, how to take the free market as the organizing and regulating principle of the state. Foucault presents the post-war West German state and the political consensus that sustained it as exemplifying this inversion in the relationship between economy and state. He writes, this was a, quote, radically economic state in which, quoting Foucault, the economic development and economic growth produces sovereignty. I'll come back to this claim a little later. So among the principal architects and advisors of this state were some of the key figures in the development of neoliberal thought. These included Alfred Müller-Armack, Wilhelm Röpke, and Alexander Ustau, as well as Walter Eucken, who later founded the journal Odo, and Franz Bohm. Because of the influence of Eucken and others who taught at Freiburg, this group became known as the Freiburg School or the Odo Liberals. A more distant influence on post-war West German political thought was Friedrich von Hayek, who founded the Mont Pelerin Society in Switzerland in 1947, explicitly to promote neoliberal ideas, and a lot has been written about the history of the society and the thought collective behind it and its eventual influence over government in many of the advanced capitalist countries. So it's the writings of these men that are the primary sources for Foucault's analysis of German neoliberalism. So when I spoke earlier about his analysis of the emergence of liberal governmentality in the 19th century, I mentioned that the corpus on which he draws is not political philosophy or political theory, but rather the texts of advisors, of practitioners of government, in this case, of economists. Foucault's analysis of liberal governmentality argued that it had always harbored a contradiction between the manner in which it depended on various kinds of freedom and the manner in which it regulated the actions of individuals and markets in order to produce those very freedoms. German neoliberalism then appeared as a response to a crisis in liberal governmentality that emerged in the 1930s, provoked by the fear that the very forms of economic and political intervention introduced in the 1920s to ward off the threat of communism amounted to a surreptitious introduction of constraints on individual and market freedom. Ordoliberalism's differences from classical liberalism are evident in its conception of the appropriate economic functions and methods of government, such as the concern to establish that monopolies are not a natural or inevitable consequence of free markets, and that measures must be taken to ensure that monopolies cannot form and distort the pricing mechanism. The ordoliberals distinguished permissible kinds of market regulation from impermissible kinds of intervention associated with economic planning. they identified the kinds of regulation of the social framework that would be necessary if markets were to be able to function efficiently and properly. The general principle of their social policy was that the socialization of consumption goods and direct transfers of income were to be avoided wherever possible. Instead, governments should ensure that individuals have sufficient resources to insure against economic and other risks. In these and other ways, ordoliberalism promised to overcome not only the crisis of liberalism referred to a moment ago, but also the existing historical and institutional constraints of capitalism. From this perspective, Foucault suggests the problem of the ordoliberals, quoting him, was to demonstrate that capitalism was still possible and could survive if a new form was invented for it. As well as distinguishing between background culture and public reason, Rawls occasionally refers to what he calls the public political culture of democratic societies, where this includes the range of fundamental ideas that inform the family of liberal conceptions of justice, such as the idea of citizens as free and equal, and the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation, along with the fundamental political institutions and the public traditions of their interpretation, high courts, and so on. Ideas about the proper functions of government, such as reducing inequality or ensuring fair value of political liberties for all, along with the policies by which they might be achieved, clearly fall within this wide view of public political culture. So too do the views about the appropriate purposes, functions, and techniques of government that Foucault considers under the rubric of governmentality. The makeup of public political culture can also be approached from the point of view of the institutional contexts subject to the restrictions of public reason. Rawls insists that these restrictions apply primarily to citizens, officials, holders of public office, and aspirants to public office when they are engaged in discussions that will determine the exercise of political power. The restrictions of public reason therefore apply in the first instance to officers of the government, including legislators and members of the executive. They apply, he says, in a special way to the judiciary and above all to members of the Supreme Court, which is, for Rawls, in many ways, the exemplary institutional embodiment of properly public reason. They apply also to citizens when they are engaged in political advocacy in the public forum, and as a result to candidates for public office, political parties and other groups who support them. However, the concept of background culture presupposes that citizens may also engage in non-public reason among themselves or in situations that do not involve political advocacy or that do not take place in the public forum. It follows that the limits of public reason apply only in those contexts that bear directly on the exercise of political power. But how are we to draw the boundaries of such contexts? There is, after all, clearly a continuum between the non-public discussion of public policy in universities, in private think tanks, or even the policy development committees of political parties. The views emanating from these different forums may contribute to an open discussion on matters of basic justice and over time change the terms of public reasoning about particular issues. So, for example, when ideas from the background political culture are taken up in policy development committees of political parties, and when that political party eventually wins office, becomes the party of government, these ideas can impact on, change the terms of public reasoning proper. So in the terms of Rawls's distinction between public and non-public reasoning, Foucault's analyses of neoliberal governmentality clearly fall within the background culture, the same background culture in which Rawls situates his own and other forms of political philosophy. Foucault's analyses of neoliberal governmentality draw attention to a kind of discourse about the nature and function of government that, while it may not have formed a part of public reason proper, was capable of inspiring a range of contributions to public reason on matters of basic justice. So the founding texts of neoliberal economic and political thought that Foucault discusses themselves may not fall within the sphere of public reason, narrowly defined, but they could and did have consequences for the kinds of policies put forward and the kinds of reason that might be offered in their support. So insofar as some of the neoliberal ideas put forward in those texts emerged from the pages of academic books, journals such as Ordo, and private forums such as the Mont Pelerin Society, and became guiding principles of government throughout much of the capitalist world, we can say that these ideas, these neoliberal ideas, have progressed from background culture to public reason proper. To take one example of the manner in which neoliberal political economy could impact on the content of public reason proper, consider the proposal to introduce a form of negative tax as a way of ensuring a basic level of access to health and other goods and services. This is an idea that Foucault discusses, and an idea that had a long history in post-war neoliberal thought. Milton Friedman put forward an early version of the idea at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. He later popularized the idea in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. And it was explored as a policy option in the US under the Nixon administration and discussed by the French government under Giscard d'Estaing in 1974-1981. Foucault recounts how French economic ministers during 1974-1975 considered the abandonment of the post-war policies of full employment and a social security system that relied on the wartime principle of national solidarity to deal with the risks faced by individuals. Instead, they proposed a system of social security that would avoid imposing additional costs and constraints on the operation of the market economy. The introduction of a negative tax that would replace various forms of welfare assistance with monetary payments to those whose income fell below the taxable threshold was one of the policies considered. Although it was not adopted in France at the time and has never been implemented in its pure form, variants of this proposal have been adopted in the US and elsewhere in the form of earned income tax credits for low-income earners. Foucault suggests that negative taxation amounted to a proposal for implementation of the neoliberal rule that no one be excluded from the economic game. This rule, he argues, is a consequence of the idea that social policy should be neutral with respect to the operation of the labour market, and that assistance should be provided to those unable to participate in the economic game only in order to ensure the maintenance of an enterprise society. In direct contrast to welfare state policies that aimed at equalizing access to social goods, neoliberal social policy is subject to the overriding economic goal of price stability, which is obtained through the market and the game of differentiation that occurs with any form of competition. In consequence, as Foucault comments, social policy cannot have equality as its objective. On the contrary, it must let inequality function. End quote. Foucault's analysis of neoliberal governmentality points to one important vector of change in the content of public reason during the 20th century by directing our attention to policy implications of neoliberal governmentality, such as proposals to replace welfare payments with negative income tax. They draw attention to changes in the implicit rules governing what can and cannot be said within the sphere of public reason proper. They show us, in other words, how the content of public reason has shifted by virtue of changes in the background political culture and its impact on policy considerations.